Welcome to Third Party Risk Institute's Ask the Expert series. So we started these last year, and if you missed them, they're actually available on the website Third Party Risk Institute as member resources. So I'm trying to really build up a lot of member resources, and I'm really so thrilled to have Karen Gray here today. So Karen Gray and I go back way back, and I used to be on the steering committee uh, for a group of people who were putting together some thought leadership for sourcing industry group. So that's where I first met Karen. I met her before that, but she was part of that group, as was I.
I'm gonna get my.
And so Karen is really your den mother type. So she's kind of she was kind of like the one with the hugs and bringing us all close. So anyhow, so thank you very much for joining us. But in her professional life, Karen is a very consummate expert. So she is manager of global customer experience for LexisNexis, and you've been there quite a number of years. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what you do and what LexisNexis is all about. And
Happy to do so. Yeah, happy to do so. Good day, everyone. I've gone from saying good morning because I'm now in a global setting with LexisNexis, and it seems I talk to people all the time that have an up to 11-hour difference in Dallas, Texas. But thank you, Linda. Very, very glad to join today. I have nearly been with LexisNexis 28 years. Coming June, it'll be my 28th anniversary. And when I started with LexisNexis, I was in the government market when we had, less to worry about in those days in '94 than we talked to Dow. But now I'm in a global position where I work with our largest global consulting firms and our financial institutions. So right now, that is a hot button for us, obviously, sanctions, negative news, and things of that nature. And my primary role as global customer success manager is really working with our departments on anti-money laundering, anti-money laundering, know your customer initiatives, and that force. So obviously in the US, we have public records to add to that, but my primary goal is to really make certain that our customers receive the most current information they can and avoid all the risks that they can in simple terms.
okay, well, thank you very much. So if I don't know you personally, I think most people on the call I do know personally, but I'm Linda Tuck-Chapman. I'm CEO of Third Party Risk Institute, and I'm really pleased to be able to present this Ask the Expert series. So today's topic is about sanctions. So I'd like to dive right into this, Karen. Sanctions are on everybody's mind these days. And what we're seeing basically is, we have the war in Ukraine. I think it's really probably up the ante. Would you say that's a fair statement, Karen?
Yeah, I would say that's really brought us the tip of the iceberg. It's probably always been a back burner concern, but yes, with the invasion of Ukraine, obviously it does have us being suspect on our business relationships.
Yeah, and I think I know you deal a lot with financial institutions, and that's really what my history is. But we're seeing basically that this is now touching everybody, because maybe you could describe just in a few words what is a sanction? What is a sanction all about?
Yeah, so sanctions are that they come from a number of different sources, obviously. For those of you that are subscribers to LexisNexis or even our other tools, we probably know Info4C as a primary publisher of sanctions. All
Mhm.
of that is governed by FinCEN, Departments of Treasury and Justice. So there are a lot of things that the G20 puts into place with regard to, is this country or is this individual a viable entity, a safe entity to do business with? And so I think in larger terms, we have set some thresholds of acceptability, not only in our manufacturing industries, but also our pharmacology, our financial industries. And that threshold prior to 2022 has been set a little low as far as, on the lower end of acceptability. And I think with the most recent avenues of 2022, that number has increased. So sanctions purely and simply are, should we be working close to people who have a dotted line to dirty money, to unfair business practices and other likes?
Yeah, and I think a lot of this started out with money laundering, right? So the whole
Yes.
anti-money laundering, and there are laws and regulations worldwide on anti-money laundering. And most companies or most countries actually do subscribe to some either kind of overarching kind of Interpol type or, a global type laws and regulations.
True.
But also each of the countries have, most, especially G20 countries, they do have anti-money laundering laws. And so sanctions were often about money laundering, and a lot of industries, because of that, felt they were exempt, that they really couldn't be easily involved, which is probably not true. I mean, there's
Right.
lots of ways to launder money. You think about oil and gas, or if you're doing business in another country and you have somebody
Yes. Blood
representing.
diamonds. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah, there's lots of ways to money launder, to launder money, but these days I think it goes a little further when you're looking at sanctions, because there's a kind of a bleed over into different types of risk, right? So we're also looking at, the number of cybersecurity incidents is rising. The number of times that companies are dealing with a third or fourth or fifth party that has bad intentions, right? They're, bad actors, who are intent on actually stealing a company's assets. And they're
Yes.
sitting inside of a third or fourth or fifth party directing activities. So SolarWinds is a really good example of this, right? It was a third party that was widely used with access controls, etc. But they were doing business with a fourth party who was doing the programming side of things for them. And they were, well, I mean, if you'd done your homework, you would have known right away. They were based in the Ukraine, and they were owned by two Russians, right? So that probably has a lot to do. I don't know, it's been completely proven, but it should be a red flag. Hey, is this the right thing for us?
Mhm.
But a lot of companies are only looking at third parties or not, and they're not looking at fourth parties.
Right.
Okay, so I want to start a little bit about kind of like the why. Oh, I did want to mention also that it's governments that are sanctioning these people and companies, right? That's where this comes from. But I think there's like, I'm trying to remember how many different types of sanctions lists there are, and I think the number is of like 166, 170, something like
That,
that.
that's pretty close. It's upwards toward 170. Absolutely.
And
And
yeah,
in the old days, we were just worried about Cuba. And now we're not
right.
just worried about Cuba. So Cuba's still on the list of providers of sanctions, obviously, but there's so many other players in the scape today.
Well, it used to be so simple, right? But now
Yes.
basically with an interconnected world, we have interconnected risks. So if you're not subscribing to a service, I mean, Karen's not paying me to say this, but you really should be subscribing to a service that
Something.
allows you to get information about who's on the sanctions list, because with 170 lists and the number of updates and changes on a daily basis, I don't know how you could stay on top of this unless you subscribe to what I call a risk intelligence solution like an LexisNexis, right? Because you don't want to spend your time chasing the data. You want to be able to manage the risk. That's the point here.
Right. Right.
Okay. So yeah, so I did a little survey actually for a client not too long ago. And I thought, Karen, we could kind of go through, because these are common questions that are being asked of people, and it's
Great.
really details around sanctions. So first of all, the question is, should you screen privately held companies?
Absolutely, you should screen privately held companies. I would say that if you're in supply chain and procurement, obviously, most of your third party relationships are not with the big publicly traded companies. They're with the smaller to mid market, especially if they are what we call a tier one third party. If that third party goes away, your business operations stop, whether it's a
Right.
shipping magnet or whether that is the widget or anything in between, obviously. So most times when you're evaluating your third party portfolio, I would say more than half are privately held institutions as opposed to the big public giants.
Yeah, and that's always a challenge, right? Because now you're dealing
Yes.
with privately held companies, and so how do you know who to screen? That's
Right.
always a big question, right? Because privately held companies, there's not as much publicly available
hmm
information.
hmm
So let me go sort of, I just want to go through. So obviously you're gonna screen privately held, and according to the survey, that's 100%. 100% sample agree says yes. And the second one is, do you screen publicly traded companies? And my little sample size also says 100% yes.
Yes. Good.
And so the next layer down is, do you screen affiliates? So an affiliate basically is where you got some common ownership, right? So should you screen your affiliates?
You should to that first level. If you have, let's just pretend that you've got 10,000 different third parties, there may be capital, whether that's human or, technological capital, that you just can't screen all 10,000, we suggest tiering, obviously. Where's
Yeah.
your high spend? Where's your high risk as far as geography? And where are those critical components of services and or goods that would otherwise contradict your ability to get product or services to then your customers? So
Oh,
that
well,
tiering
you
model.
just need to expand your CV and talk about basically a third-party risk management, because this is relationship segmentation,
Yes.
right? At the end of the day, a relationship segmentation framework that sits in your third-party risk management program does exactly that. Allows you to determine the criticality of the relationship, right? And so if it's important to your organization or to the business, right, it's something that they can't easily replace, or it has a risk exposure, basically it's in, whether it's private, public, etc. And the
Right.
second criteria is around exposure to risk. So you may not be able to easily spot exposure to this type of risk. So I would have to say, if you're going to put some risk treatment on it, then you should go through sanction screening. And that's best achieved through a relationship segmentation in a defined program.
Right.
So that's exactly right. Now, the interesting one around affiliates is a lot of companies, I would say about, yeah, exactly half of my little sample size say, no, they don't screen affiliates,
Oh, wow.
which is kind of interesting, because I believe the expectation is, yes, you do screen affiliates, right? If you are a regulated entity, you are expected to screen your affiliates as well. Now, there
Yes.
are some thresholds. If it's an affiliate where you have more than 50% ownership, you do have control of the company. You
Right.
probably get away without screening those. If you
Mhm.
have less than 50% as an affiliate, which is the most common model, then
Yes.
you should be screening them, right? Because
Yes.
they can make their own choices. You don't have to approve them. You may think you have great risk insight, but you don't have to approve those choices, right?
Right, right. And Linda, that's what really tips our hand into ultimate beneficial ownership when we
Yep.
start talking about who has control, who has governance, who has a vested interest in the company going this way or the
Yep.
company going that way. So that percentage point really is driving toward that lower double digits as opposed to that higher double digits that we were looking at probably a year ago.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because one of the questions I tried to think, I was doing a little survey for a client, and I thought, well, what would I want to know if I were sitting in the chair? And
Yes,
I
yes,
asked specifically, if you're sanctioning shareholders or beneficial owners, and I do want to come back to UBOs, right? That's what they're
right.
called these days, UBOs. Is
Yes,
do you screen those shareholders or beneficial owners for sanctions? And half of the organizations said no,
wow.
and the ones that said yes said only if it's more than 25%.
Okay.
Right. So let's go back to your comment just a second ago about double digits. So
Yes.
yeah, so why would you want to set your thresholds differently? If you could just recap what you just said about that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. So the threshold of acceptability, that's my phrase, but that
I
seems
like
to
it.
be one that
Yeah, I'm gonna
it,
borrow that
it
one.
resonates, right? And I would also say that if you are not sort of reinventing your process, given that we are now all more global companies, our
Yeah.
third parties are global, you should be reevaluating these processes on an ongoing basis. And
Mhm.
that's not just monitoring. Linda, you and I both know that we can set up an alert. That alert could be on sanctions, it could be on adverse media, it could be on legislation that changes, it could be on a whole number of things. There
Mhm.
is so much knowable data today. And if we're not doing more than just a Google search, which doesn't give us everything, contrary to popular belief, but if we're not capturing that knowable data, then it's as though we haven't done any sort of screening whatsoever. That model a year ago, and I say that with great fervor, a year ago might have had you reevaluating your assessment processes twice a year, or maybe
Right.
at the end of your calendar or the end of your fiscal year. What should we do different? What did we learn this year? Where did we get burned? We don't have that luxury any longer, right? And that burn is a wide open door, reputational risk, exposure to economic risk, societal risk. So if
Mhm.
we're not monitoring those things or changing our motion of that assessment with greater frequency, I would say that most of the customers that I'm visiting with on the global scale, They are looking at that at a quarterly basis right now. They're trying to gear up their resources that allow them to do that. Now, whether that technical concept needs some investment on the technical investment, software, services like us, or the human capital investor.
Right.
I was just with the CFO of a trust company last week in New York, and he does most of his searching, oddly enough. And I was like, there's just a lot out there for you to do, Mr. CFO. And he said,
Yeah,
I've
people
just
have other
he
things
goes,
to
I
do.
got to get some help. I got to get some more people in the door, obviously, because, he's being pulled somewhere else. And so he's looking to grow his team by 75% just to do what needs to be done on a day in, day out investment of those dollars. So I would say once a quarter, given 2022 has really thrown us into a whole different landscape.
Okay, so I just want to parse out a few things you said. First of all,
Yes.
is really to give some really serious consideration to the threshold of acceptability around
Yes.
the ownership percentage, et cetera. Because when you're looking at thresholds of acceptability, it may not be a one size fits all, right? If you go to a
Absolutely.
relationship segmentation framework and you have a technology that can help you sort the wheat from the chaff, it
Right.
may be that certain types of relationships, your threshold can be higher.
Mhm.
Certain types of relationships, your thresholds may be lower, and that's simply because of the influence that this person could possibly have on the actions of the company.
Right.
So
Right.
that's something really to consider. And when you get down to private companies, my observation would be that in privately held companies, when you start to think about A, you should definitely screen which people are doing.
Yes.
B, the next consideration is around not just the company officers, right? So when you're looking at a sanctions, you want to look at minimum top three officers, named officers, right? So
Agreed.
CFO, CEO, and perhaps the CIO or something. You're going to look at named officers. But when it comes back to beneficial ownership, one of my observations is that in privately held companies, it's a lot easier for the bad actors to sit in the background as a substantial shareholder, directing the actions of those named officers, as
Right.
opposed to having themselves as a named officer.
Right.
Once they're a named officer, they step out of the darkness into the light, and you might say, "Hey, wait a minute, I'm not sure I want to do business with you
Yes.
because."
Mhm.
So I think that when you're looking at how to shape your program going forward, you really want to get a little bit more granular instead of saying it's a binary on off. So first
Right.
of all, relationship segmentation, and it goes without saying, without technology, if you haven't figured out that you're drowning a third party, you probably is because you already drowned and you forgot to notice.
Right.
Right, so have a technology solution. It can ingest all this information because you said there's lots of information available. That's
Mhm.
good and bad, right?
Right.
Because the more information you have, the more you have to react to it. So
Right.
having a system that allows you to ingest risk intelligence from
Mhm.
companies like LexisNexis and determine where do those alerts go. They don't have to always go to
Yes.
the CFO. That's like
Yeah.
not a good strategy.
Or
Right.
chief legal
So
counsel or, yes.
yeah, exactly. So when you ingest the risk intelligence and you have a problem, right, who gets alerted? You can use your
Right.
system to do that. And then it's basically looking at things like the ultimate beneficial owner,
Mm.
the who should be part of it, whether you're looking at shareholders or affiliates, etc. Is start to figure out if you have a technology, can you calibrate and link it back to risk exposure or your criticality, etc. Because these systems are powerful. They can allow you to parse the information so you're not getting like this giant data dump that you don't know what to do with.
Right.
Right. So it sort of starts and ends with a good segmentation, technology, and then the
Mhm.
right solutions, workflow to the right people so that they can deal with it.
Right.
So yeah. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about any exemptions. Have you ever seen anybody exempted from this?
I've
From
not.
sanctions? Okay,
Yeah.
and we're finding that.
Person or company or country, frankly.
Yeah. So the other question that has come up is whether or not you have to ask permission to check for sanctioned peoples or companies. Do you have to
Great
ask anybody's
question.
permission? Yeah.
Yeah, great question. I got this question from someone the other day, and sanctions are not part of the U.S. public records that are governed by the GLBA or the FCPA, or to some extent the DPPA. So if those are a lot of acronyms,
Yes,
the
they
drug
are. Thank you.
So those are the DPPA. I'll start with that end, is the Driver's Privacy Protection Act. Very different, but when we look at motor vehicle registrations, VIN numbers, plate numbers, that's governed by an act here in the States. That's not sanctions, right? That's not a vehicle that's owned by a company. The GLBA, the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, which is now, I think, in its 22nd year, I think that happened around the early 2000s, where that is that personally identifiable information that financing institutions, real estate transactions use your social for, or they use that exact birthday for. That doesn't have anything to do with sanctions in this model. So that's not governed. And then the other is the FCPA. So when you start to look
Which is the
at
Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, for those of you who
exactly,
are not familiar with it. And even though that's the name in the US, this exists worldwide. And if the
yes,
US Department of Justice finds someone guilty of violating FCPA, that has worldwide, yeah, that's not just for the US.
yes.
That countries worldwide pay attention to convictions, whether they're in the US, whether they're anywhere in the world. And the UK has very, very strong laws around this as well. So
And Linda, you're right. That goes hand in hand with the UK Bribery Act. So
exactly.
looking at that UK Bribery Act, I will make available this due diligence checklist that does have a side by side of the
Yep.
UK Bribery Act and the FCPA and what components of that both of those acts look for. But kind of back to the question at hand, sanctions do not fall under those permissible uses that those US acts are governing the use of otherwise public records. This is not considered to be a public record like a bankruptcy filing or your home ownership or a UCC filing, something like that.
Mhm. Okay, so I have a couple of questions that have just come in.
Yep,
So,
I saw the chat
uh,
coming in, Linda.
okay,
So I'm cocking
so it
my head
says,
back to look at chat. So
okay, all right, so it says, what is your view on political exposure screening and
mm,
adverse media screening? And to what level would you go through for you, ultimate beneficial owner? Because this is actually kind of related. It's not exactly sanctions, but you're looking for bad news.
right, right. If we start looking at PEP or public or politically exposed persons, it
Yep,
is
you're
not.
great at acronyms, by the way.
Yeah.
I just call those PAPs, right? Don't worry
Yeah.
about whether or not you can
I, I
understand these, so,
I
yeah.
would say anyone that's looking at me signing in, Karen E. Gray. So I've lived with an acronym for my name for all of my life. So acronyms are second nature. But think about your PEP screening. So we know that people that are politically exposed have a tendency to be involved in where the corporate or the state-owned entity gets their money and how they govern that money. So
Right.
much greater risk for money laundering, much greater risk for bribery. So it's not
Much bigger
illegal.
risk for violations of FCPA as well, right? Yeah,
Right. So it's not illegal to do business with a PEP. I
right,
might have married a legislature. I might have been the aunt to someone that, sits in a powerful position. That doesn't make me a risk. It just means that I'm exposed to someone that does have risk or associated with their position being, either a state-owned entity or otherwise. So just make clear that it's not illegal to do business with a PEP. What that means to you is you have to figure out how that PEP exchanges with your third party. If it's a
right,
cousin, an aunt, or someone that's way down the list, but if it is a roommate or a former business colleague to the leader of or an oligarch of, said entity that you're going to do business with, then that may be an internal decision of not doing business with that entity. So PEP screening is also something that we at LexisNexis also purport. That
right,
could also be a push technology. It could be on a person's name or the entity or the country. So that push is where you define your entity and get updates to that, obviously through electronic means.
right. And so the first step obviously is trying to figure out who the heck they are.
Yeah.
So let me
Yes.
step back, basically. When we're looking at who we're trying to cover for sanctions, we're looking for people, right? Whether
Yes.
or not they're a bad actor, whether or not they're a match for some name in somebody's database. We're looking at high-risk countries as well, because when I look at sanction screening, I also would highly recommend that you look at high-risk countries. There are solutions that risk intelligence solutions that can give you insight because geopolitical risks are changing these days, et cetera, et cetera. So you're looking for bad actors, bad companies, right? Companies that have been named, and bad countries, right? So I always call that nice and simple: bad actors, bad companies, bad countries. And then you kind of got yourself covered. So it's back to trying to figure out, how would you know? If it's publicly traded, you have a great deal more information that's available.
You do.
And it's a lot harder for those companies to hide away sanctioned peoples because, because for example, if you're a stock exchange, you're going to be constantly running through, like 24 hours a day, those listed companies run through to see if you're going to turn up a problem.
Right.
Right. It's hard to hide. If you're in a privately held company that is not publicly traded, it's a lot easier. So I go back to thinking about, you're going to have to ask the third party for this information and rely on them giving you something truthful. So you're
Right.
looking at usually top 3 officers, maybe more, depending on what you're getting into. And you also want information around their directors, right? Who are
Yes.
their directors? Because their directors are where they have a lot of influence possibly on the company, and that's where they hide. And in fact, you may even want to look at their board chair.
Yeah.
Right? So
Yeah.
that's something to consider, because the board chair basically might also be another person who can truly have some influence. Because don't forget, the CEO it reports into the board of
Right.
directors, right?
Those
And
shareholders.
to the chair.
Yeah. Agreed.
Right. So, yeah. So we want to get that covered. And then basically we're looking at the screening. We're looking at beneficial owners, ultimate beneficial owners, affiliates, et cetera. So we're trying to kind of narrow the field what we're looking at, which is another reason why you need a risk intelligence solution.
True.
Now, and then a lot of companies do look at negative news. And negative
Yes.
news, back to, please don't do a Google search. You'll just get buried in data. So there are companies that specialize in negative news. And I would tie that back in answer to this question to look at your relationship segmentation framework. What is
Right.
important and what could hurt you, right? Do you
Right.
want to screen on everything or just on certain ones or certain risk exposures?
Yeah, Linda, so
Yeah,
obviously LexisNexis has some tools in that space. We
yeah,
have some off-the-shelf language that can be interpreted in, any language across the country, or at least those markets that are, either emerging or established markets.
right.
Where we find customers today, if I'm in a pharmaceutical company or a banking, my triggers for negative news are different. Drug tests may be here, but espionage may be here. So there are
Right.
some tools that do not allow you to customize your own adverse media triggers. I would suggest that you look for a tool that meets your needs. If you need to, change that language, whether it's artificially, interpreted or not. 3 years ago, we were on a project that all of a sudden COVID-19 was a negative news term. And 3 years ago, we were not looking at that in our off-the-shelf product.
That
So
is, you don't
customers,
remember those good old days?
right, and it's 3 years ago. Bless us for all, surviving that part. But in a minute, we had to change our course. It was really the first time we heard the word pivot, and we had to, incorporate viruses and vaccines and policies and things of that nature on your business.
And
So
geopolitical risk and all that kind of stuff.
totally true.
Yeah. So I think that
So
what
that
we're really
adverse
saying,
media, it has
sorry.
to grow with your prospect of, how you're evaluating your third parties, obviously.
Yeah. And so if you're out there building or maintaining a third-party risk management program, try to
Yes.
make sure you get some budget dollars on a quarterly
Yes.
basis or at least a half yearly basis, because if it's a once and done, you're going to be in trouble in about 6 months from now. So
Yeah.
anyway, now I want to go to specifically, now the South African Reserve Bank has done
Oh,
a
okay. I saw
superb
that.
job on third party. And I actually have had a fair amount of interaction with people in South Africa because the Federal Reserve Bank there is actually really very forward looking. So there
Good.
is a question here about struggling to get social security numbers from US entity directors to do the
Mhm.
screening.
Mhm.
So they're using name and company names and they're getting
Right.
a lot of false matches. Do
Mm.
you have any recommendations for them?
So a couple of ideas come into play for aggregators such as LexisNexis and our other companies. We go through what's called a credentialing process for
Mhm.
any company or sole proprietorship, even a law firm, who needs to access public records because of those acts,
Right.
the FCPA, the GLBA, etc. So that credentialing model
Mhm.
since it is not for, let's say, newspaper reporters or not for a reunion planning company. Like those have gone away. The casual use of your investigative reporter, not covered by the act.
Right.
So in some instances where we have companies who do have locations in other countries
Mhm.
who are screening US entities, we can make that credentialing allowance. That business case is written, it goes to our risk department, and that credentialing is granted. What I would tell you is that you could not search LexisNexis for Karen Gray's social. You would have to have the social in order to use that as a search parameter. So
Right.
if your customer or if your prospect is providing you with a social that doesn't align to that, red flag or at least an orange flag for that. So you can't use LexisNexis to find socials, but you could use someone like LexisNexis to find who's attached to a reported social.
Yeah.
Or
And
if
so it
someone
goes
else is
back to
using it.
yeah,
Yes.
it goes back to how do you get your data? So
Yes.
basically, where I recommend that you do this is in what I call pre-screen. So if you're onboarding a
Yes.
new third party, you would actually put this in your pre-screening. And pre-screening is before you do all the heavy duty due diligence on controls, et cetera, because that's a huge amount of work and takes a lot of expert resources. So
Mhm.
if you design your lifecycle management so that if you're going through and you're either onboarding a new third party and you've already gone through your sourcing event, et cetera, and you decide this is who I like to work with,
Yes.
or your top two, you could run these through the process. And
Mhm.
also, if you're doing a renewal, don't forget to run them through before you get through, into starting to renegotiate the contract or re-sign it. Because a lot can happen since the last time you signed that contract. So this should be for
Absolutely.
new and renewals, right? So that's a really important part. I know you want to say something. Go ahead.
Well, I just remember the old days of, calling on the world's two largest companies that were in my space, and they both required LexisNexis or me as their agent to show up with my credit report so that before they would do business. And while the credit report is great,
Mhm.
we're so past that today.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
so and to get an appointment, to get in the door, you had to have your Experian or your DMB credit report within a 90-day wiggle room to even
Yeah.
get an appointment to do business with these, two obviously large companies. And so, again, that's gone by the wayside. So, that technology that Linda's speaking of about making that efficient and making that, proficient as far as a searcher or automated is sidestepping just the need for the financial footprint of your third party, whether it's private or public.
Right, and so you have to do all these things, by the way. Okay, I have some questions that were asked before. Some people,
Okay.
I really like it if you send in questions before the event. So the
Okay.
first question is, how often should you perform sanctions screening on your supplier base? What are your thoughts on that?
Pardon me.
Yeah, so how often should you run your supplier or third party base through your sanction screening?
So I think given the most recent landscape of how often sanctions change,
Yeah,
I would say that the primary authority of sanctions information, the compilation of those hundreds of lists,
yeah,
I would say that most of those are updating daily and or monthly.
yeah,
So I wouldn't suggest a once a quarter, because when you start talking about the departments of treasury or the departments of, economic affairs out of Switzerland or the council on the European Union, those are coming into third parties like LexisNexis who package that up daily and weekly. There are very few that come in monthly. I would say probably a third of those when you start looking at the Nordic countries like Norway. I think Malaysia comes in monthly. But, when you start looking at those that come in more recently,
mhm.
that drives your most recent approach to have there been any sanctions. And nobody wants to be 60 days out on what otherwise is knowable information.
I hear you. So I asked this question in my little mini survey here.
You did?
And
And what'd you
yeah, the
get?
responses I got were on selection,
Oh,
right?
okay, great.
So quarterly,
All right.
and a couple of pretty, like one particularly large organization said that they run it through their data, they run their database of suppliers through every night. Now, bear in mind, a lot of organizations that I do, that I'm more familiar with are financial institutions, and they have
Yes.
large anti-money laundering departments who are part of
Right.
the financial crimes department, right?
Right.
So the financial crimes department and or your compliance group typically has resources to do this. So I'm just putting a word of caution. So I hear you, Karen, that it's changing every day. I was listening to the radio 2 days ago. Canada has just sanctioned another 750 people, right? So, yep. So the lists are getting pretty long every day from every country.
Yes.
But to your point, basically, if you're only doing this on selection, you got yourself a huge problem. If you're
Agreed.
just doing it like maybe once or twice a year,
Agreed.
that's so good either, right? So if
Yeah.
you can find a way to subscribe to risk intelligence and run your database through a lot more often, I mean, daily would be ideal.
Right.
Then you would at least be able to get ahead of the curve if you got yourself a problem.
Yeah.
So then this is a really good question. I want to address this one next is what happens if you have a match? Good question. I love this question. I just didn't want to run out of time before we tackled it. So what
Order
happens
the
if there's
balloons
match?
and the float and give a parade, Linda, right? It's like, and we've always said, finding nothing is sometimes good, right? So it's good unless you're a really, cruddy searcher or whatnot. So,
Yeah, yeah.
you know,
If you're doing a bad job and you never get a match, yeah,
right.
that's not so good. But if you do a good job and you do get a match, Karen, what are you seeing in your clients? What do they do about it?
Yeah, I was on a conference yesterday with some of the leaders in government agencies. Some had legal backgrounds, some are with my competitors. We're all sort of in this together. It doesn't matter if you're buying
Yeah.
from me or something else. So we're all really, brain sharing because this is changing so much. But one of the things that we, interpret obviously with our customers is make certain that your legal stakeholder is in this discussion. It can't be just your CFO. It can't just be your security person, because what's going to happen eventually is those contracts between you and a third party, there is going to be some sort of out clause, if then, an if and a consequent clause that are going to have to follow the legal arrangements that you have with your third parties. And that may get into if any part or any agent is sanctioned during the course of this, legal contractual agreement, we have the right to cease and desist. We have the right to cancel. We have the right to whatever. So
Right.
I would say let's not make our decisions in a vacuum. Let's make certain that our CFO is in talk with our, chief technology officer, with our chief legal organizational officer, that we don't leave them out of the mix. Sometimes we do make decisions and we're like, oh, don't go to legal or don't go to procurement. They have to be all on the same page. So I do see
Yeah.
that that's probably coming. I don't
Okay.
think they're there yet. I don't think
Yeah.
that obviously my customers aren't there yet, but they've realized it. It's second week of April. Already realized that it needs to change the contractual language with their third parties.
Yeah, so there's 2 points here. One is that,
Yes.
as you go through contract renewal or amendments or whatever, don't forget to add
Yes.
the legal language in around what happens if there's a sanction around notification. They
Right.
should notify you because they probably have figured out if one of their big shareholders has just showed up on a sanctions list,
Absolutely.
right? But that puts them in breach of contract if they don't notify you. And the second thing is that if they are, what are the consequences, right? So you have to have the ability to make an risk-informed decision what to do next. So
Yes.
how do you get there? If you have a well-designed third-party risk management program, you have probably some sort of challenge function and governance and oversight. So you need to be able to escalate this in an orderly manner up to decision makers, whether that's through the third-party risk management office, the procurement office, or compliance if there's a match, because different parts of the organization may be doing this work, whether financial crimes, compliance, procurement, and third-party risk are the most common areas that are actually responsible for this. It needs to go up basically for a review because it may be a potential match that isn't a match at all, right? It needs to be investigated,
Right.
right? Because some people do have very similar names, right? Like not me, but a lot of people do. And
Yes.
so I just want to remind you that it needs to get up to senior decision makers for a review. And that review should consist of, if you happen to have a chief risk officer and your chief general counsel should, and possibly with your CFO, right? Because there's a lot of impact here, right? So the first review should be decided, is it a match and do we have a problem? The second thing is that your senior executive are going to have to make a value informed decision. And it's back to, you know, if in fact, let's say it's a shareholder and they really don't have a lot of influence, right? You're going to make a decision. Now, I was talking to Karen ahead of this, and so one of the things I heard about 2 or 3 weeks ago, because I'm based in Canada, so we had a lot of Canadian news. So the Trans-Canada Pipeline is rather a big deal here, right? It's billions and billions of dollars worth of expense, and it's been very controversial. Well, lo and behold, 75% of this deal is coming from a company where one of the Russian sanctioned oligarchs owns 28%. What to do? What to do? So I think that there's few things in the world that are really black and white when it comes to risk. Your organization needs to make risk-informed decisions. But on the other hand, let's say that it's a software that is very invasive. They have access to protected information and access to your network and systems. You probably have a very different response than if it's a product that you're buying. Let's say that a furniture manufacturer turns out to be, on the bad companies list, right? You can easily replace them, or basically, like, what kind of risk are they really going to present? Just check those chairs for listening devices,
Right. Yeah. And
right?
Linda, I go back a little bit to readdress the opportunity to get your chief
Yeah,
legal counsel involved. That legal counsel is typically overseeing your mergers and acquisitions department or that activity. So we want to make certain that if you screened a company 6 months ago at the initial engagement with that
right.
company, that they don't acquire a company and they didn't do the due diligence on their acquisition. And then that causes then that, that spiraling. They might have acquired a company that proper due diligence wasn't on, conducted on, and then you're linked to them as well, just by association of the family tree.
Yeah, M&A activity and legal entity management is incredibly difficult, especially
Yeah.
in the US, especially because companies will stand up a company just for your contract, for example. I mean, or they'll be acquired, like the amount of fluid movement. So before we wrap up, I just want you to speak briefly to the problems of establishing ultimate beneficial ownership.
Hmm.
And so, why is it so hard to understand who owns the companies, Karen?
Well, I've got some insight, Linda. So,
Okay,
so one of the things that one of the chief executives from one of the most recent banks said is Russia is about 25 years ahead of the US on their transparency model. I stopped. I put a question in the chat, just like our attendees. 25 years, I couldn't believe it. So we think we're great, but this tip of the iceberg with the Ukraine invasion obviously has this bold number of spotlights, not just one on Russia. So UBO obviously is ultimate beneficial ownership.
right,
Most likely FinCEN is looking at that, and they're very liberal in how current they have to be in reporting.
right,
A company has a year to file their initial reports with UBO and FinCEN. That's a year. So
right.
if in that year something changes from that initial date, there's an effective date that even if our sanctions are updating daily and weekly, that FinCEN could still be 6 months behind, you know, the
Or
gold, the gold, so to
364
speak,
days behind,
or
right?
364 days,
Yeah,
right? So regarding changes, I think there's a 30-day wiggle room of filing that. So we're always chasing the bunnies, so to speak.
mhm,
And so that's unfortunate. So that's where I say we need to really follow the legislation of who governs the, FinCEN and the decisions that are made obviously out of the US. We partner with DNB for our UBO information. So we are directly in line with the data that they provide. But we're only as good as the governing body who collects that information, can report to us. I
right,
would say, and I told this to Linda a little bit earlier, just doing some assessment, out of 100% score, what the G20 puts into place with regard to the 10 things that you should do, Russia scores a 61.8% out of 100 on their reporting of UBO. So
right. So,
they
so,
really
so if
got.
your child comes home with a 61.8, you're probably going to give them a little extra homework.
Well, it makes that double digit, creep toward the bottom more so than the, the mean average of what was acceptable a year ago. It makes me look at the 15%. It makes me look at the 10% really with a different lens.
It does. And so I think it's really comes back to know your third party. Now, I am going to wrap up here. This is like, I mean, I think we could talk for another hour, Karen. This is such a fascinating topic. I want to thank you so much. You are amazing. And I really appreciate you being here today and sharing your knowledge. So once again, this is
My
Karen,
pleasure.
Manager of Global Customer Experience with LexisNexis. I'm Linda Tuck-Chapman, CEO of Third Party Risk Institute. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. This will be available accurate. Thank you for the test. This will be available on our website, and I think Arsh is going to publish this, or he's going to publish a whole series on sanctions on LinkedIn and on our website. And so our next Ask the Expert is May the 16th at the same time. If you have a topic you'd like us to cover, or at Third Party Risk Institute, please send me a note, and would be delighted to find another speaker as good as Karen, which is going to be really difficult. But I'm loving this conversation. So thank you so much, Karen. And thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great week.
Okay.
Thanks, Linda.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.